Somewhere in Ohio, in the winter of 1993, a retired school teacher named Margaret picked up her kitchen phone on the second ring. The voice on the other end was confident, young. She'd remember that later. How young he sounded, and how certain. He wasn't selling something exactly. He was sharing an opportunity, a small cap stock, undervalued, about to move. He'd done his homework. He had numbers. He had a name, Stratton Oakmont. And names like that sounded like old money, like marble floors and leather chairs, like the kind of place that didn't need to call you, but was doing you a favor by calling anyway. Margaret's husband had died 2 years earlier. She had $47,000 in savings. She'd spent 31 years teaching fourth grade in a public school, grading papers at the kitchen table where she was sitting now, and she had never once gambled in her life. This didn't feel like gambling. The young man said the word conservative 4 times in 8 minutes. She wrote it down. Conservative. She called her brother-in-law afterward, and he said it sounded legitimate. She invested $15,000. 6 months later, the stock was worth nothing. She never got a single dollar back. That is where this story begins. Not on a yacht, not in a limousine, not in the roar of a trading floor where men threw staplers and screamed into phones, and someone once released a flock of doves, and a dwarf tossing contest passed for a Monday. That is where this story lives. In the quiet of a kitchen after the phone stops ringing. In the moment someone realizes that the money they saved across 3 decades of a careful, decent life is simply gone. His name was Jordan Belfort, and by the time the federal government finally closed in on him, he had stolen somewhere between $100 million and $200 million from people exactly like Margaret. People who trusted the phone. People who believed that a company with a name like Stratton Oakmont wouldn't call a retired school teacher in Ohio unless they actually had something worth saying. Here's what most people know about Jordan Belfort. Leonardo DiCaprio played him. He threw a lot of parties. He had a yacht called the Naomi, after his second wife, and he sank it once near Sardinia. Audiences laughed and cheered and left theaters wanting to be him, or at least wanting his energy, his nerve, his absolute refusal to be ordinary. The Wolf of Wall Street grossed $392 million worldwide. Jordan Belfort sold the rights to his memoir before he finished paying restitution to the people he robbed. He now charges up to $30,000 per speaking engagement, where he teaches salespeople his secrets. Those secrets were originally perfected on the telephone in a converted car dealership in Lake Success, Long Island. In 1989, Jordan Belfort grew up in Bayside, Queens, in a middle-class household where money was always present as a topic, and always just slightly out of reach as a reality. His parents were accountants. He understood numbers early. He also understood, early, that the story you tell about a number matters more than the number itself. He sold lemon ice at 12 from a cooler on the beach and made a few $100s. And he told himself that this was the beginning of something. By 22, he was enrolled in dental school at the University of Maryland, and the dean told incoming students during orientation that the golden age of dentistry was over, that they would never get rich as dentists. Jordan Belfort withdrew the following day. He did not wait to see if the dean was right. He had heard the word never directed at his ambitions, and he treated it as information about the speaker rather than about himself. He sold meat and seafood out of a truck for a while. The business went bankrupt. He moved to Manhattan. He got a job as a trainee stockbroker at L.F. Rothschild, where he encountered for the first time the architecture of a trading floor. The noise, the hierarchy, the way information became currency the moment it moved from one mouth to another. Then Black Monday hit in October 1987. The market dropped 22% in a single day. L.F. Rothschild collapsed. Jordan Belfort, barely in his mid-20s, found himself at the periphery of the legitimate financial world and made a decision that would define the next decade of thousands of people's lives. He didn't push harder to get back into the legitimate market. He went to a boiler room in Long Island that sold penny stocks to people who didn't know what penny stocks were. And here's where the machinery first clicks into place. Penny stocks, what the industry calls microcap or over-the-counter stocks, trade outside the major exchanges. They're cheap, they're lightly regulated, they're almost impossible to research, and the commissions on them, unlike the capped commissions on NYSE-listed stocks, can be enormous. 50% in Stratton's case, meaning if you convinced someone to put $10,000 into a penny stock, $5,000 of that money belonged to the broker before the stock moved a single cent. Jordan Belfort looked at this system and didn't see a flaw. He saw a career. He was spectacularly good at sales. Not charming in a Hollywood way, though he had that too, but technically, mechanically good. He understood the structure of persuasion the way a surgeon understands a body. He developed what he called the straight line system. Move the conversation from opening to close along the shortest possible route. Eliminate detours. Answer every objection before it fully forms. Keep the target nodding. He could hear hesitation in a voice and route around it before the person on the phone knew they'd hesitated. He could make a $3 stock sound like the most conservative decision a careful investor could make. In 1989, with a partner named Danny Porish, he founded Stratton Oakmont. The name was fabricated. It suggested heritage and establishment and a history of conservative wealth management. There was no Stratton. There was no Oakmont. There was a converted car dealership in Lake Success, and then a larger office, and then a floor of young men, most of them barely out of high school, many of them from working-class backgrounds with no financial credentials and no licensing beyond what Stratton itself provided, learning Jordan Belfort's scripts and dialing the telephone, hour after hour, calling the Margarets of America. This is the part that gets buried when the story becomes entertainment. The film shows the chaos and the decadence. It does not linger on the other end of the phone. But the other end of the phone was where the actual crime lived. The pump and dump works like this. Stratton would acquire large positions in a small company's stock, cheaply, quietly, before the calls began. Then the brokers would start dialing. They'd call dentists and teachers and veterans and small business owners and retired firefighters. People with savings. People who'd read enough about the stock market to believe it was legitimate, but not enough to understand what they were looking at. The brokers would talk up the stock, the fundamentals, the growth trajectory, the inside knowledge, until enough people bought in to drive the price up. Then Jordan and the firm would sell their position at the top. The price would collapse. And the people who trusted the young, confident voice on the phone would be left holding stock worth pennies or nothing. Think about what that actually means. A veteran in Arizona who'd saved $30,000 over 15 years. A couple in New Jersey who'd set aside money to pay for their daughter's college tuition. A widower in Minnesota who received a call 3 months after his wife's funeral and thought, maybe now is the time to finally do something smart with the insurance money. These people were not naive. They were trusting. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. They trusted an institution. They trusted the telephone. They trusted that a company with a name like Stratton Oakmont, calling from New York, with a professional and polished young broker who knew the numbers and spoke with authority, they trusted that this person was not allowed to simply steal from them. They were wrong. Nobody can say with precision how many people Stratton Oakmont defrauded over its 8-year run. The SEC has documented hundreds of victims in the cases that went to court. The actual number is almost certainly in the thousands. The losses are conservatively estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. These numbers appear in legal filings and regulatory reports, and they sit there in government documents. buried under the celebrity and the spectacle of the man who caused them. Stratton Oakmont operated in relative impunity for years. The SEC received complaints. The NASD, the industry self-regulatory body, investigated. Fines were levied and paid, and Jordan Belfort kept going because the fines were less than the profits. This is the detail that the legal system prefers not to examine too directly. For a long time, the math of regulation said crime paid. The fines were a cost of doing business. Jordan Belfort, who understood numbers, understood this too. By the mid-90s, Stratton was making tens of millions of dollars a year. Jordan was living in a $6 million mansion in Old Brookville. He had the yacht. He had the car collection. He had a helicopter he crashed once while under the influence on his own lawn. He had a quaalude habit so extreme that at one point, while severely intoxicated, he drove a white Ferrari home from his tennis club without any memory of the trip and found the car buried in a stone wall. He describes all of this in his memoir with something very close to nostalgia. He was, by every external measure, having the time of his life. Every morning that he woke up in that house, someone else woke up and checked a brokerage statement and felt the specific cold panic of watching money disappear and not understanding why, and not having anyone who would explain it in terms that made sense, and not having $30,000 to lose and nowhere to go to get it back. The FBI arrived on a Tuesday morning in 1996. Agents knocked on doors. Computers were seized. Jordan Belfort sat in his house and calculated, as he'd always calculated, what his options were and which of them offered the best outcome for Jordan Belfort. He cooperated. This is presented in his telling as an act of conscience, a moment of reckoning. What it actually involved was identifying his associates, recording conversations, and handing over individuals who had, many of them, learned everything they knew about securities fraud from Jordan himself. He wore a wire. He fed information to federal agents. His associates received sentences ranging from 1 year to 4 years. Jordan Belfort received 22 months, served 22 months at a minimum security facility in Nevada, where he reportedly played tennis and wrote the first draft of his memoir. 22 months for $200 million stolen from thousands of people. And this is the part that should make something inside you go quiet and cold. Not because it's surprising, but because it confirms something you already suspected about the relationship between the legal system and people who steal elegantly. A man who robs a convenience store with a note gets 5 years. A man who robs a retired school teacher in Ohio of her life savings with a phone call gets 22 months and a book deal because he was useful to the government, because the people he gave up were also criminals, because the machinery of cooperation rewards those at the top of the criminal hierarchy for handing down the people they corrupted. The court ordered Jordan Belfort to pay $110.4 million in restitution to his victims. For years, he paid almost nothing. The argument was that he didn't have the money. He was, however, collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars in speaking fees during this period, selling books, optioning his memoir to Hollywood. The court documents tell a story of a man who understood that restitution, like regulation, was a cost that could be managed and deferred. As of the most recent public accounting, he has paid back a fraction of what was ordered. The victims, most of them now much older, some of them dead, have received fractions of fractions. Margaret, the school teacher from Ohio, doesn't exist as a named individual in this story. Her name has been changed, but she is real in the sense that matters. She is the composite truth of hundreds of documented victims, of specific people with specific losses who appear in SEC filings and court records and depositions, and are then, in the cultural translation of this story, made invisible. Because the movie needed a protagonist, because the memoir needed a voice, because it is apparently much easier to sell a story about the man who stole than to sell a story about the people who were stolen from? This is the question the entire narrative has been building toward, and it is not a comfortable one. We watched The Wolf of Wall Street and we laughed. The 3-hour runtime is propulsive and hilarious, and DiCaprio is magnetic, and the movie is, as filmmaking, genuinely excellent. And we came out of it, many of us, wanting to be in that room, wanting that energy, wanting whatever it is that Jordan Belfort had, which was the absolute freedom from caring what happened to the person on the other end of the phone. Jordan Belfort understood something that most people don't want to believe about themselves, that if you make the crime entertaining enough, people will cheer. That if you frame exploitation as ambition, audiences will find it aspirational. He figured this out on a trading floor in 1989, and he is still figuring out how to profit from it at $30,000 per keynote stelkimeish and speinashino today. The victims understood something different. They understood that the phone could ring in an ordinary kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, and by the time the call ended, the architecture of a careful life could be quietly, irreversibly altered. They understood that the system was not built to protect them. That the names on the buildings, Oakmont, Stratton, any of it, were costumes. That the confident young voice was a script. That conservative was a word deployed with deliberate precision against people who had spent their whole lives being exactly that. $110 million ordered, a fraction paid, thousands of people still waiting. And somewhere, right now, Jordan Belfort is probably on a stage. The lights are warm and the audience is rapt, and he is explaining the straight line, the close, the way you move a conversation from hesitation to yes, and the audience is leaning forward because they want to know. They want to know how it's done. They want the secret. He's still selling. That's the part that should stay with you, not the parties, not the yacht, not the 22 months. The fact that the machine never actually stopped. It just found a different product. And we are still, some of us, still buying.